Hello, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way. I'm Mark McCord. This is your podcast that highlights some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, but also looking at their history, culture, and geopolitics. And today we're going to jump into another fascinating country in South Asia. But before we do that, I want to do a couple of other things. As you know, the companion to this podcast is my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, which is available on Amazon. If you haven't read it, I hope it's a pretty good read and hope that you will consider getting a copy and reading the backstory behind some of my work around the world. But also, a couple of other exciting things are happening. First of all, my new novel, The Ghost of Mariupol, is live. It went live on March 23rd on Amazon, and I am extremely pleased to announce that the proceeds from the sale of this novel is going to the Ukraine Society of Indiana, which is doing such great work in providing relief for Ukrainians who are under attack, of course, as you know from my previous podcast episodes. But also, they're doing an excellent job in just raising visibility for the Ukrainian cause in the United States. And so ordering this book will not only provide you with what I hope is a great story and what I believe is a great story, but will also benefit the cause of Ukraine. And so grab a copy of The Ghost of Mariupol. It's a really gripping narrative, and I think that you will enjoy it. Also, on March the 4th, on February 23rd. I'm totally incorrect. On February 23rd, my book, The Unfinished Continent, went live on Amazon. This is a look at the history of foreign assistance, especially American foreign assistance in Africa. What's gone well, what hasn't gone well, and the new approach, I believe, that's needed to create agency within Africa and to allow Africans to move forward in both modernizing and growing the economic and social and political capacity of their continent. It's about Africans. It shouldn't be about the political machinations of any other country in the world. It should be about what's best for Africans. And that's what I extol in this book. And so if you're interested in foreign policy, you're interested in the flow of foreign assistance, you're interested in hearing the story of what's working and what's not working from someone who's actually been there and done that, I hope that you'll grab a copy of this book on Amazon. It's available both in hardback, which is what I'm holding here, but also in paperback. All right, that being said, we are now going to jump into a new country in South Asia. Once again, before I do that, and before I forget it, I hope that you enjoyed our series of episodes on Ukraine and also our discussion with Gershon Baskin on Israel. These are special reports that I'll be bringing to you throughout the year with some very interesting guests. And while they may seem to be juxtaposed in between the discussion of different countries, I think it's really important for you to hear these special reports and to get the understanding from those on the ground and those who are involved as to what is really happening in countries around the world. So I hope that you've enjoyed those and more to come. So today we are going to jump into a country that I worked in South Asia that I found very fascinating. I didn't work there as long as many other countries, but my work and my travels there were fascinating, and I do want to share them with you. This is the country of Sri Lanka, or the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, which some of you may know by its former name, which was Ceylon. It's an island country in South Asia. It's located in the Indian Ocean, southwest of the Bay of Bengal, and it's separated from India by the Gulf of Mannar and the Palk Strait. Sri Lanka also shares a maritime border with Maldives. Many of you have heard of that beautiful island nation. That's to its southeast, and then India to its northwest. And it lies across the Bay of Bengal from Bangladesh and Myanmar to the northeast, and Andaman and the Nicobar Islands of India to the east. Colombo is its largest city, and it's the political and financial center. Sri Lanka has a population of about 22 million people, with the Sinhalese people who speak the Sinhala language forming the vast majority, while Tamil is spoken by the large Tamil minority. And we'll be talking about the Tamils a little bit later in the podcast. There are other long-established ethnic groups on the island, which include the Moors, the Indian Tamils, the Burghers, the Malays, the Chinese, and the Veda. Sri Lanka has a documented history of over 3,000 years. And obviously, we're not going to jump into all 3,000 years today by any stretch of the imagination, but we are going to cover some of the most important historical, cultural, and geopolitical issues on the island. Sri Lanka was shaped by ancient kingdoms, by colonial powers, by breathtaking landscapes, and regrettably by a civil war that scarred generations. It's a place where tea plantations roll like green oceans, where Buddhist stupas rise above the jungle canopies, and where the Indian Ocean has carried traders, conquerors, and refugees to its shores for thousands of years. We're going to explore the country's history, culture, and geopolitics. And yes, we're going to look at its long and painful civil war that still echoes through the island's politics and identity. So let's get started. Sri Lanka sits just off the southeastern tip of India, as I said. It's close enough that on a clear day, fishermen swear they can see the mainland. But culturally, historically, and spiritually, Sri Lanka has always been its own world. From the earliest kingdoms, more than 2,000 years ago, the Sinhalese people trace their origins to migrants from northern India, while the Tamil population has deep roots in the island's north and east with connections to southern India. Buddhism arrived in what is now Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BC and became the spiritual backbone of the Sinhalese kingdoms. Their ancient capitals still stand today. Vast stone cities, reservoirs, monasteries, and stupas that feel when you're there to be almost mythic. It's really hard to understand until you're standing there and you're witnessing these thousands of years of history before you that highlights not just the cultural palette of the island, but also its religious palette as well. For centuries, Sri Lanka has been at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean, a place where Arab traders, Chinese envoys, and Southeast Asian sailors stopped for cinnamon, gems, elephants, and stories. And of course, it has an amazing reputation for what? Can you tell me? How about Ceylon tea, some of the best in the world? But the island's destiny changed dramatically with the arrival of colonial powers. Who were these powers? Well, the Portuguese arrived first in the early 1500s, drawn by cinnamon, a spice that at that time was worth more than gold. They built forts, converted coastal communities to Catholicism, and fought bitter wars with the Sinhalese kingdoms. Then came the Dutch in the 1600s, who pushed the Portuguese out and built their own administrative system. But it was the British. Of course, it was the British, arriving in 1796, who reshaped the island most profoundly. They unified the island under a single colonial administration, introduced English education, and most importantly, transformed the economy through plantation agriculture. And this is where you saw the rise of things like tea, rubber, and coffee. To work these plantations, the British brought in Tamil laborers from India, creating a new demographic layer that would later become central to Sri Lanka's political tensions. By the time the island gained independence in 1948, the seeds of future conflict were already planted. Now remember, the late 1940s, a lot was going on in South Asia. You had Pakistan that was gaining independence. You had India. You have Sri Lanka. So, in addition to everything that was going on in what is now the country of Sri Lanka, the geopolitical context around them was vastly changing. And that's what led to these seeds of conflict. Just as the partition between India and Pakistan created the seeds of conflict that have now lasted until the current time, the foundation for conflict that was laid with Sri Lanka's independence also created some of the most challenging times for the island in recent history. And we'll get to that in just a few moments. But first, we want to take a look at its culture because Sri Lanka has such a rich, rich culture. And I'm going to be sharing some of my photos from Sri Lanka on my Facebook page and also on the podcast site on YouTube so that you can experience some of the beauty and majesty, if you will, that is connected with Sri Lankan culture. Its culture is a mosaic. It's vibrant, layered, and deeply tied to a sense of place. As I said, from a religious standpoint, Buddhism is the majority faith, shaping art, architecture, and daily life. Hinduism is central to Tamil identity, however. Islam and Christianity add further depth to the island's religious landscape. Now remember this, the Tamils, because not only are they a different ethnic makeup, but they are also a different religion. And you know, it's interesting that Buddhism in Sri Lanka is the religion of the majority. It was also in Cambodia, two places where some of the most horrific wars and genocides took place. And you wonder if you know any Buddhist or you've been in a Buddhist culture, how that could even happen because they're a peace-loving people. But it's this friction that is created. And one would argue that this friction is directly tied to something I alluded to earlier, and that's to colonial times. It was the British who brought the Tamils to Sri Lanka. It was the British that overlaid a different ethnic group and a different culture on what had been not a unitary culture or a unitary ethnic makeup, but one that had been cohesive. And they brought in this outside faction that created friction on the island and ultimately that almost tore it asunder. And then, of course, you can't talk about Sri Lankan culture without talking about food. And I love food. So just about every podcast I share a food story, but I love Sri Lankan food because it's so bold and fragrant. There's rice and curry, coconut sambal, hoppers, katu roti, spiced seafood pulled straight from the Indian Ocean. And I mean, this stuff is fresh on your plate. It is fantastic. Whether you're in Colombo, Kandy, or any place in between, you're going to eat well in Sri Lanka. And the flavors, the spices, just explode in your mouth. It is amazing, amazing food. Some have tied it to India, and it is a derivative of Indian food. But Sri Lankan food has a flavor and a texture and a a concoction of spices. Pardon me. That's all its own. As far as language goes, as I said before, Sinhala and Tamil are the two major languages, and each carries centuries of poetry, folklore, and memory. English remains widely used because it's a legacy of colonial rule. You'll find, especially in the cities, a great number of people who speak English and speak it well. Not so much outside of the larger cities like Colombo and Kandy, but you'll still find English widely spoken. Sri Lankan culture is also very much tied to art and ritual. From the Kandyan dance to Tamil temple festivals, from Buddhist Pararas to Muslim Eid celebrations, Sri Lanka's cultural life is rhythmic, it's colorful, and it's deeply, deeply communal. But beneath this beauty, political tensions have simmered since colonial times. Tensions that would erupt into one of the largest civil wars in Asia. And that, of course, is the Sri Lankan Civil War. To understand the island today, you have to understand this war. It's a conflict that lasted 26 years, from 1983 to 2009, and it left thousands dead. So, how did it start? Well, after independence, Sinhalese majority governments passed policies that marginalized Tamil communities. Remember, for the most part, Tamils weren't indigenous to Sri Lanka. They were imported there from southern India by the British, who had also colonized India, to work in the tea, rubber, and coffee plantations. But they brought with them their own culture, their own language, their own religion, and has created friction with the Sinhalese majority. And so once the British were gone in 1948 and Sri Lanka was an independent nation, this majority government began to lock down on the Tamil minority. In fact, they passed what's called the Sinhala Only Act of 1956, which further eroded the freedom of Tamils on the island. They introduced a university quota system to ensure that Sinhalese students had the preference of university. They also adopted policies that discriminated from an employment standpoint against Tamils. And they initiated citizenship restrictions for Indian origin Tamils. This created a groundswell of anger among the Tamil community. Tamil political movements initially pushed for federalism, more autonomy, but not separation. But as these restrictions continued to get more draconian and tensions escalated, militant groups emerged. The most powerful of the Tamil militant groups was what is known as the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, led by Velapulai Prabhakaran, pardon me. I always I practice that name all the time, and I never can get it right. But Prabhakaran is the name. The goal of what's called the Tamil Tigers, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, was very clear. It was to create an independent Tamil state in the north and east of Sri Lanka. Of course, this was greatly pushed back on by the Sinhalese majority government. And the fuse was lit in July of 1983 when the killing of 13 Sri Lankan soldiers by the LTTE triggered an anti Tamil groundswell across the country. Hundreds were killed, thousands fled. This was called Black July, and it radicalized a generation that made civil war inevitable. So here you had two groups. The British created the bomb that was later to go off and put a fuse on it. Black July ignited the fuse. And that made this civil war a finality. There was no going back from Black July. So looking at the war itself, it was, as most civil wars are, very, very brutal. There were suicide bombings, child soldiers, assassinations, mass displacement, and entire towns in the army and LTTE. In fact, the LTTE pioneered the suicide vest and carried out high-profile assassinations, including the killing of former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. The Sri Lankan government responded with overwhelming military force, especially in the war's final years. I was there during the latter years of this conflict, and I can tell you it permeated every piece of society. You couldn't have a conversation about policy without there being a reference to the Civil War. Tourism was at an all-time low because of the Civil War. And one of the interesting things that I remember that was just kind of a reminder of the conflict that was going on is a trip that I made over to Kandy, which is really the cultural heart of Sri Lanka. And this beautiful city is the home to an elephant orphanage. Sri Lanka has long been known for its elephants, and especially its working elephants that worked on the different plantations. But they also have wild elephants. But these elephants were as much caught up in this war as everyone else, and it created a lot of orphans. It created elephants that were injured to the point that they couldn't live in the wild anymore. And so this orphanage was created to care for them. So I visited this elephant orphanage, and I will post some pictures on the Some Stops Along the Way YouTube site. But I had the opportunity to see the war from a little bit of a different lens. Of course, I'd already talked to people on both sides of the conflict, to some Tamils, but also I had a lot of colleagues there that were Sinhalese. And so I had the personal perspective. But just a poignant reminder of this war was when I went to this elephant orphanage, the number of baby and small elephants that were orphaned. But also there was an older female elephant who was there. And at a certain time of day, the elephants had been at the orphanage long enough that they were used to going down to the river every day, at least a couple times a day. And it was at the same time every day. So when the bell rang, the elephants would literally walk down the middle of the street in Kandy and make their way to the river. And I had the opportunity of following them. And I watched this older female elephant that just had 2.5 legs. I'm sorry, 3.5 legs, not 2.5, 3.5 legs, hobble down to the river. And I asked my host there about this elephant, and he said that her leg was mangled by a landmine. And so she couldn't live in the wild anymore, obviously. So she'd been taken in by this orphanage. And she had quite a great time at the river. The young elephants loved her. She was well taken care of. But this was just a reminder of the things that were going on in Sri Lanka at this time. Their production had virtually tanked. Their exports were especially of their core commodities like coffee, tea, and rubber were down, all tied to this debilitating civil war. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the final months of this war alone. That's how brutal it was. To this day, the end of the war remains politically sensitive. It's celebrated by some as liberation and mourned by others as a humanitarian catastrophe. Post war Sri Lanka has struggled with this issue of reconciliation. The Tamils are still there, they still feel oppressed. And yet their armed resistance was snuffed out. This was not a war where there was where it was a stalemate and both sides just decided to stop fighting. The government ultimately defeated the Tamil Tigers and forced them into surrender. But they did very little to create reconciliation with the Tamil people. Also, demilitarization has been an issue because it's still a country that was heavily landmined and where munitions continued to be available in all parts of the country. Of course, there are land rights issues because during the war, land was taken illegally by both sides, creating huge numbers of issues. Accountability for war crimes is still a huge issue. And of course, the issue that partially created this problem to begin with still exists, and that's Tamil political representation. In other words, the war is over, but the wounds are still open. The memories are still raw. Even so, the island continues to move forward. It's uneven, it's imperfect, but if Sri Lanka has taught us nothing else over its history, it's taught us that it is resilient. So let's look now at Sri Lanka from a geopolitical standpoint. Sri Lanka's location, as I said, is right along major Indian Ocean shipping lanes. So it makes it strategically invaluable as a logistics point. India sees Sri Lanka as part of its natural sphere of influence. It intervened during the Civil War, it sent peacekeepers, and it remains deeply involved in Sri Lankan politics and security. But of course, China, anywhere in Asia, and really now around the world as China's global influence grows, is also heavily invested in Sri Lanka through the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is not just an Asian initiative by China. The Belt and Road Initiative is one in which Chinese companies are building roads, building infrastructure all over the world, and creating economic ties to China through primarily debt that these countries go into to improve their infrastructure, which, of course, builds the profits of Chinese companies, but it also ties those countries politically to China. The Chinese have also built the Hambantota port, Colombo port city, and done other major infrastructure projects, all of which now the Sri Lankan government has to pay for. And so China holds a significant amount of influence, both politically and economically. These investments have sparked debates about debt, sovereignty, and geopolitical alignment. So, where do the United States and Europe stand in the geopolitics of Sri Lanka? Well, the US and EU focus on things like human rights, democratic governance, and maritime security. All of these are important. However, you see the dichotomy here. The Chinese, and to a certain extent, the Indians, are providing things that Sri Lanka needs today. They have to have better infrastructure. They have to have modernized ports. They have to have security. While the EU and the US are focused on things that, while important, are not the things that the Sri Lankan government values as highly: human rights, democratic governance, and maritime security. The Chinese are winning the game because they are providing what is absolutely needed by the Sri Lankan government. So when you have this support coming from different areas, and by the way, the United States support to Sri Lanka has greatly been reduced with the demise of US aid. So the US influence in Sri Lanka, which was shaky at best or tangential at best, has now been eroded even further. But the island of just 22 million people finds itself balancing a lot of different interests: India's proximity, China's money, and the West's political pressure. The Indian Ocean is really like a chessboard. And the outcome of this chess game, geopolitically, isn't known yet, but I can tell you that the Chinese and Indians are in better position than those that they are playing against. Because you see, Sri Lanka is not just an island, it's a strategic anchor in one of the world's most important maritime corridors. And that makes its politics and its future deeply intertwined with global dynamics. One of my biggest regrets when I worked and traveled in Sri Lanka was not traveling to Maldives. It's relatively close proximity, and by all opinions, a beautiful place to visit. Although its capital city, Male, is, I understand, one of the most densely populated and borderline atrocious places that you can go. All the beauty you see of the Maldives is out in on its different atolls and islands where the big resorts are. But Maldives is an example of this chess game that's going on in the Indian Ocean. And Sri Lanka is a major player in that game. Maldives is very unstable from a government standpoint as well. And you talk about killing the goose that laid the golden egg. Sri Lanka had, like Maldives has primarily tourism, but Sri Lanka had spices, they had rubber, they had coffee, tea, tourism. They had so much going for it. And yet the seeds that have been created through these decades of colonialism, first by the Portuguese and then by the Dutch and finally by the British, created the instability that virtually led to the unraveling of this island nation, and that's led to this continued high stakes chess game throughout the Indian Ocean region. So Sri Lanka is a land of contradictions. On one hand, it's got breathtaking beauty, and I saw it while I was there. I was able to get into some of the rural areas, into the jungles, into areas like Kandy, which is their cultural center. I sampled its beautiful and flavorful food. I stood on its beaches. I interacted with its people. Absolutely stunning. It's a land of ancient traditions, but it's also a land of modern struggles. And it's a country of some of the greatest hospitality you can find, but it also has massive unsolved issues and unresolved trauma. Sri Lanka is a reminder that history is never simple, the culture is never static, and the geopolitics is never just about maps. It's always about people. People who, in many cases, feel powerless about their condition. One of the flashpoints for this civil war was the oppression of one group, perceived or not, the repression of one group in favor of another. The Sinhalese majority fed or lit the fuse, if you will, of the bomb that the British created. And that created fractures that still are present today. Because you can stop the fighting, but the memories don't go away. And the stories don't go away. I think I'll stop there. I could go on quite a bit longer about Sri Lanka and about this region in particular. But I think that gives you somewhat of an overview. And as I said, I didn't spend a lot of time working in Sri Lanka, so I don't want to extol myself as any kind of expert. What I can tell you is this, that in the conversations I had both with government officials and those in the private sector who are Sinhalese, and also those who are Tamil, that they're still miles apart on how they view the situation on the island. Do you remember when I did the episode on Cyprus? And I spent years working in Cyprus, so I'm very familiar with that situation. And how the fighting has stopped. It's more of a war of words now, but the things that caused the conflict never went away. Well, it's the same in Sri Lanka. No one has dealt with the seeds of this conflict. No one has been able to bring the hearts and minds of the people together. And that's a big danger because where there is still this friction, conflict could arise again. I'm not sure why we continue to go down the same road, why we don't learn from the past. And that leads me to a little teaser, if you will, for our next episode, which is going to be another special episode. This one won't have a guest, but it will cover a topic that is germane to everything I've talked about on this episode and those that preceded it. And that is the United Nations still a useful partner? Is the United Nations still relevant in trying to mediate disputes, such as this one in Sri Lanka, to fulfill its role of bringing countries together so they can have constructive dialogue, to hopefully stop conflicts before they start, to create economic growth and good governance. Does the UN still play a critical role, or has the UN's mandate become more one of raising money and bureaucratic processes and humanitarian relief? We're going to look at that in the next episode, which will be a special episode of Some Stops Along the Way next Monday, 8 a.m. I hope you will join us then. Until then, I hope you've enjoyed this episode on Sri Lanka. And don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment. I'd love to see your comments, and check our Some Stops Along the Way podcast page on YouTube, where I will be posting photos and some backstory information on this and other episodes. Again, thanks for joining us today. We'll see you next time on Some Stops Along the Way.